Right, folk, I do want to make one comment about your papers. Most of you turned yours in, and I regrettably have not checked in a week to see who has and who hasn't. But I will check hopefully sometime today or tomorrow. Anyway, there's always one theme that's kind of outstanding among the, and in this class, the theme that three of you wrote a paper about was women's rights. And for the first time, I actually saw one man write a paper about women's rights, which I thought was kind of unique. Now, I'm hesitant to say this, folks, but I want to say it anyway. In my day, when I was a young man, there was a movement called the Women's Lib movement. And a lot of the young women I knew embraced it. And several of them who did wound up remaining unmarried. That's all I want to say about that. Okay, I'll be quiet. I mean, they're my age, you know, in their early 60s, late 60s, and maybe that's the way you like your living. I don't know. I mean, a whole lot of the adult population in this country now is unmarried. That happened in the Roman Empire late in its history also. And all of you know the Roman Empire fell when it was overrun by a bunch of barbarians. We call them Germans, but they were barbarians. And the Roman Empire fell. All right. That's all I want to say about that, unless some of you have a further comment. But now I think all of you pretty well together my take on some of these issues. I mean, I know there's political correctness, and folk, there's hardcore, hard-nosed reality. And oftentimes our modern day political correctness runs right counter to reality. All right, we'll move on. We left off last time with Great Britain. Margaret Thatcher, I do want you to remember that name, Margaret Thatcher. There was a movie about her made a couple years ago called Iron Lady. It was either in the beginning of 2011 or 2012. Did any of you happen to see it? All right, several hands go up. Yeah, Iron Lady, based on a true story. They're trying more and more to make the historical movies more accurate. Anyway, it would flash back from the Margaret Thatcher that was alive at that time. Margaret Thatcher has since passed on, but from the Margaret Thatcher whose mind was failing her, who would imagine her husband was still there, even though he had been dead for a few years, but her mind was going bad. And then back to the Margaret Thatcher, who you want to remember as the Prime Minister, the Margaret Thatcher who was in charge. All right, moving on. Eastern Europe. The people living in Eastern European countries longed, ached to become part of the rest of the world. They saw the rest of the world advancing, moving forward, and advances made in literature, arts, and theatrics, among other things, as well as science, and they felt themselves left out. With the downfall of communism, a lot of these countries joined NATO, joined the movement to stop communism, in other words. One country, Czechoslovakia, split in two. It became the Czech Republic on the one hand and Slovakia on the other. Basically, that was a move that might have been inevitable. They spoke different languages. I have to say now that these countries have not done very well as far as prospering. Now, I had a Czech student, a girl from Czechoslovakia in my class a few years ago who disputed that in one of the class. If you want to, if you're from that part of the world, and I never ask people where they're from, and you say, hey, I know my country is prospering, you're welcome to say so. But for the most part, these countries do not appear to have prospered as well as their Western European counterparts. Now, they have joined the European Union, which I'll talk about later. But a lot of persons are a little bit leery about having them join the European Union because when you join a union with some country that's a lot poorer than you are, instead of you making them richer, they wind up making you poorer. This is what basically happened to Germany when Germany united with East Germany, when West Germany united with East Germany, they thought we'll make East Germany richer and they'll come to our standard of living. Instead, wound up the East Germans were not as productive as the West Germans, and it was difficult to get that kind of productivity out of them, that kind of industriousness, and it wound up making the whole country poorer than it had been before. Maybe the East Germans benefited, but not that much. All right, I'm going to get back to the European Union in a few pages. But Yugoslavia had been ruled for many years by a man named Tito. Now, Tito was a remarkable fellow. He was a communist, but other than that, he was able to keep Yugoslavian people at peace with each other. The Yugoslavs were a very diverse group. They had Muslims, Roman Catholic, and Eastern Orthodox Catholic, people who would normally have been at each other's throat. He kept them in some kind of harmony and unity, and at the same time tried to make a communist country out of them. Remarkable man. Regrettably, he had to pass off the scene like everyone else does eventually. And when he did, Yugoslavia split into several countries, and their hatreds, the old hatreds, came out and they started fighting each other. Milosevic Slobodan Milosevic, and I hope I'm spelling that right. M-I-L-O-S-E-V-I-C. Yeah, okay. He was an Eastern Orthodox Catholic, but some of the Muslims living in that region began to practice terrorism against his group, and his answer to the terrorist issue was to go in and slaughter by the tens of thousands. And he killed more than 10,000 young men and boys, which reminded Europe of the Holocaust they had been through a generation and a half or so earlier. And the world came down hard on him. The United Nations, though, wouldn't touch the issue because, after all, they had just classed these people we killed as terrorists the year before. Now, all of a sudden, some people wanted the world body to take their side and show sympathy with them. So instead, NATO moved in. And eventually, the United States got involved because the United States is a member of NATO. The United States sent some troops to help bring order. Fortunately, this was a war where no American young men were killed, or at least very few. But eventually, NATO was able to quell the uprisings and separate the men, and Milosevic himself was captured. He was put in prison and was intended to be brought to trial, but he died of cancer before his trial could happen. One thing also I want to say about the issue, President Clinton at the time said that the United States was going to send its troops to be put under NATO commanders, and this was something that had not happened in World War I or World War II. American troops had always fought under American commanders, and a lot of people became extremely upset. Hey, you know, is he going to send our troops and put them under NATO commanders? And eventually, when President Clinton saw that this move was extremely unpopular, he changed his mind, decided that American troops would only serve under American commanders and not under the command of foreign officers. To this day, troops from NATO remain in Bosnia. Occasionally there's a little bit of flare-up in that region. That the flare-up is because these ethnic groups tend to dislike each other and have disliked each other for quite some time. Russia gets involved too because Russia has long had ties with the Eastern Orthodox people in the region. In fact, that's what got World War I started. An Eastern Orthodox man shot the heir to Austria's throne, and Russia said, we're not going to let our Eastern Orthodox buddies be crushed. And the result was a major war was started. And this was brought out during the time that this trouble was flaring up in the early 1990s, about the time I guess some of you were being born. The new Russia. With the Soviet Union's collapse, Russia began to struggle to put itself back together, and it has been just that, a struggle. The United States opened more favorable trade, and for a while it looked like the United States and Russia would become friends. But as time went on, the friendship began to collapse, and it's now, at least at this moment, obvious that the friendship cannot last. Now, this book was written before the present, yes?
You said after what?
After the collapse of the Soviet Union. There was a Soviet Union collapse between 1989 and 1991, 2-year period there where the Soviet Union collapsed and all of Eastern Europe was left the communist camp. I mean, it might have looked like the Soviet Union was completely powerless, but here's the dilemma the Soviet Union faced in 1989. Every one of their 16 republics wanted to leave all at once, and all the Eastern European countries wanted to leave at once, and Russia simply was not strong enough to fight Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Albania, Romania, and as well as fight its own republics, 15 wayward republics. So basically, the Soviet Union simply split up, and folk, it can happen to any country. In our own country, there are whisperings from time to time of states, people leaving our union. We haven't heard these kind of whisperings in 150 years, but there is talk about it as some people become more and more discontent with the way our country's going. And if a whole bunch of states left at once, more than did 150 years ago, then it'd be difficult to hold it together. But anyway, your book talks about Vladimir Putin, but again, this book was written before the present crisis. Vladimir Putin had to step down because the Russian Constitution did not allow him to serve as president more than a couple of terms, but then he became prime minister, and as prime minister, he still runs the country. And as for Mendeleev, you don't hear much about him. It's all Vladimir Putin. All right. I think most of you by now know what's going on at that part of the world. Russia is trying to annex the Crimea, which they say was rightfully theirs. Khrushchev gave the Crimea to Ukraine back in 1956, but the people of the Crimea say they want to join up with Russia. And this is going to affect the other republics because there are a lot of Russians living in the other republics, particularly Belarus and several of the others. And they might all decide, hey, this is our time, let's all rise up and rejoin Russia. And they could create a big bunch of chaos in that region. And personally, folk, I fear that the United States is on the wrong side of the issue. Now, here's the thing that's happened that really should be frightening to everybody here. The Ukraine last week required that all Jews living in the country should register. And folk, this reminds us so much of Adolf Hitler. It's not widely talked about, but nevertheless, it is one of the books. They want all the Jews living in Ukraine to register as Jews. And we don't know what the outcome of that will be. It could be the United States could find itself fighting on the same side as people who are anti-Semitic. Because right now, officially, we're supposedly on the Ukraine side. All right, hey, this is very much up to date. Anybody have any ideas, thoughts, comments? I mean, I know this school is right smack in the middle of a Jewish community, and I very much respect that. But again, is our country going to take a side of the people who are fast becoming anti-Semites?